Hello, this is Rich Herb, your teacher for Hebrew history. We'll be looking at lesson 11, Exile and Return. Our text for this lesson was the book of Nehemiah, the book of Ezra, and the book of Daniel. Quite a lot of reading. And you may not have had a chance to read that ahead of time. So after we've gone over this lesson, if you'd like, go back and read that, and that'll fill in some of the gaps that we have today. Let's start with our big idea, and that is God can and will use ungodly nations to accomplish his purpose. And we've seen that in the past, we've seen that in the Bible, we've seen that in our current history. So let's begin. We're going to talk about today the rulers. First, we'll talk about the Assyrian Empire. Let's do some review first here. The divided nations have fallen. In 721 BC, Samaria, the northern nation called Israel, the capital, the 10 tribes fall to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and the Israelites from the northern kingdom go into Assyrian captivity. A while later, the Judean kingdom with the other two tribes were captured in 586 BC, when Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, completing the conquest of God's people. So where we start here is God's people are in captivity, and now they're about to come home. In our outline today, we'll talk about the Assyrian Empire first, which is the ones that captured the northern tribes. Then we'll talk about the Babylonian Empire, which captured the southern tribes, the Persian Empire, which took over the Babylonian Empire, which allowed the Israelites to come home. Then we'll talk a little bit about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And probably there's no lesson 12 for this course, but I think what I'm going to do is do a bonus lesson 12, talking about the intertestamental period between when the last prophet Malachi speaks and when John the Baptist comes on the scene. Those 450 years between the Old Testament and New Testament. We'll give a little bit of talk on that in our next lesson. Realize, though, there's no Bible books for that. That would be strictly history explaining what happened to the Jews in between the two times and in the preparation for when Jesus came. So we'll be getting to that here in a little while. So let's begin here and talk about the Assyrian kingdom first, the ones that took over the northern Israel. In 745 to 727, Tilgath-Pilser was one of the greatest monarchs of antiquity. He was really the first person to gather together a lot of tribes and countries and rulers and to consolidate an empire, which would be similar to what the Roman Empire was and so forth, later empires. He defeated Babylon in 743. He collected tributes from Israel, and Israel paid these tributes for a while to stave off being taken over. Another king ruled on for 5 years and came upon Samaria, the capital of Israel. And the king Hosea, king of Israel, was rebelling, and they lasted 3 years in this before they were captured. Sargon II, another Assyrian empire, finished the siege on Samaria and took control of Israel, the northern kingdom. And Sennacherib started harassing the southern kingdom of Judah, but never got around to capturing it. We don't have a map here, but if you get a map out and look at this, the Assyrian Empire was pretty big. It went all the way down to Egypt, all the way up around to where Babylon was and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They conquered Israel, as we said. If you want to read about this, it's in 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6. They moved some of the people out of their lands, and they moved some people into the lands. According to inscriptions by Sargon, now this isn't in the Bible, this is from history, 27,290 people were moved. The northern kingdom Israelites were carried off the foreign lands and intermingled with the nationals, and those who stayed in Israel intermingled with the Gentiles. And this is where this legend of the lost 10 tribes happened. It's not a legend. These 10 tribes intermarried, and other people came and intermarried, and they left. They never formed distinct tribes again since then. Like any of the world empires that God uses, they did fall. When the last king died in 625, the disillusionment of their empire was not too far off. Uh, its hold on the West had greatly slackened. A lot of the people, the tributary people that were paying tribute, were revolting. Bands of Scythians, a nomad Aryan race from the region on the steppes, were sweeping through the Assyrian Empire's falls, Palestine, and Egypt. And the prophecies of Jeremiah and Zephaniah reflect their method of warfare and fierce characteristics. You can read about that in those books of the Bible. They were driven back, however, at the frontier of Egypt and appeared to have returned to the north without even evading Judah. They bypassed Judah. Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, around 606 BC, fell. Now, remember, Jonah went to Nineveh, and Nineveh had a revival. This appears to be about 150, 200 years. Jonah was there. They had the revival, and they went back to their old evil ways. The prophet Nahum was immediately before the fall. So if you want to read a little bit more about Assyrian history in Nineveh, read the prophet Nahum. From the north, these hordes were closing in upon Nineveh on all sides. They were weakened. And the Medes formed an alliance with the Chaldeans, who soon afterward revolted and took it over. You can read about God's step-by-step prediction of the empires rising and falling in the prophecies of Daniel. If you remember the prophecies of Daniel, as you read that, if you've read that in the past, Daniel dreamed of a statue, and each of the parts of the statue were different type of, whereas the different empire that was to come upon the world. And the Assyrian was first, Babylon was next, and of course it went through Greek and Roman later on. The Babylonians took over then. They were the next people that were in charge. Let me check my notes here. Nebuchadnezzar, who we'd read about in the Bible, was the mightiest king of Babylon. He was a great builder, built some cities. After Nebuchadnezzar, there was a few kings of no great achievement. I won't read their names. You wouldn't know them anyway, and they're hard to pronounce. They all reigned very short periods of time. And then there was a king called Nabonidus, who was more of an explorer than a conqueror. And his son was Belshazzar, who you probably remember from Daniel. Jeremiah was a prophet at this time. And the mission of Jeremiah was a tough one. He was a prophet in the crises of the history of Judah, and he had to preach obedience and loyalty to the king of Babylon. And moral reformation is the only means of escaping vengeance from God that was coming upon the land and people. And of course, we know that the people did not practice obedience or loyalty to the king, and they were not morally reformed. So he tells them in the name of God of the great judgment that was to come at the hand of the Chaldeans. He even predicts the period of their subjugation, how long it would be. Judah refuses, and as we said earlier, in 586 BC, they are conquered, the cities burned down, the temples burned down, the things from the temple are stolen, and all the instruments, the gold, the silver, the candelabras, the brazen altar, all those, the shields were all taken back then to the capital in Babylon. Judah was to be captive. How many years? Most of you out there know that. 70 years. And that's told to us in Jeremiah 25, 1-12, or 2 Chronicles 36, 21. Why was it 70 years? Because God recognized that Judah and Israel had missed 70 Sabbath years. So God took them 70 times 7, 490 years. They disobeyed the command. And that's why it was 70 years. So what was life like in Babylon? Again, you can read in Daniel chapter 1. At this time in the world, it was the greatest city in the world. The people there had great freedom. They were not locked in jails or slaves necessarily. They had great freedom of movement. They were able to correspond. There was religious structure. The elders were still in place from the tribes that were there. And Ezekiel was a prophet at this time. And he gave direction to this nation how to operate under Babylonian control. Still, they were displaced from their homeland, which was many months away and hundreds of miles, and they were disgraced among the people they now lived. So we do know, though, that in Daniel 5, because Belshazzar and his arrogant ways, Babylonian fell. And do you remember who Babylonian fell to? That would be our third part here, which would be the Persians. The Persian properly known as the Medes and the Persians, but the Persians won out in time, so it just became to be called the Persian Empire after a while. And that's we can read about that empire in Esther 1:3 and Ezra 1:1. King Cyrus of Persia was the one who ruled at this time, and he was the greatest leader of his time. He was sort of a unique leader, different than all the other despots. He had a kind heart and he cared about people, actually. And he was sensitive to the Spirit of God, Ezra 1 tells us. His decree in Ezra 1, 2 to 4, verses 2 to 4, allows the Israelites to go back, Judah specifically, to go back to rebuild the temple. And that was under the priests of Zerubbabel. Then we learn about opposition to the building in Ezra 4, 1 to 6. And then in Ezra 4, 24, stop building the temple. And as you read Nehemiah and Ezra, you find out there's various times there where first the king said, go ahead. Then the king said, no. Then they protested and they said, go ahead. Then the neighbors got mad and sent letters to the king and they said, no. So it was a stop and start process. But there's a series of kings before Darius. They restarted building again, and the temple was finally completed. Then we have Xerxes I, which we know from history. And actually in the book of Esther, he's called Ahasuerus. And there was opposition to the building of the walls. Finally, Artaxerxes was the next king of the Persians. And Judah is allowed to go back to reestablish the law. And who went back and did that for them? It was the scribe Ezra. That happened, and then it was a while, and then Nehemiah came, and he went back to rebuild the walls. And again, read Ezra, Nehemiah, a fascinating story of the stop, start, and how God worked out getting those walls rebuilt so quick through the people who were not professional builders or anything. How Nehemiah planned that and did that. It was fascinating. Next, we come to return the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Talk about that for a moment. They went back first, as we said, and there weren't a whole lot of them went back. I think it was only 20-some thousand to rebuild the temple for worship. And Zerubbabel did that. Next, Ezra went back and to reestablish a spiritual focus. And he read the book of the law and tried to teach God's law to the people. And his main thing was to get them to repent of intermarriage with the pagan wives. Next, we have Nehemiah coming back, as we mentioned, and he rebuilt the walls for protection. He also tried to reestablish godly living there. He read the law. He had the people confess sins. They reaffirmed the covenant. They dedicated the wall and reformed the Jewish people back to what they should have been before. Then we come to the prophet Malachi, who writes the last words of the Old Testament. Still under the Persian rule, but many are back to Jerusalem and the surrounding region. And Malachi writes maybe 150 years after Nehemiah, after everyone else is dead and gone. We'll talk about this in our next lesson. Not a very uplifting book. It sort of closes the Old Testament in a sort of a downer note. The people are right back where they were. And unfortunately for them, God does not speak to them through a prophet for silent years, 400, 450, somewhere in that range. We'll give you the exact number next lesson. But remember, here's the conclusion, and this is something we need to think about. God will use other nations to correct his people when they walk in disobedience. So for homework, I know this was a really shortened lesson here, but I just wanted to give you the quick finish of the Jewish history. For homework, go back and read Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. And if you want to jump on next week's lesson, read Malachi. It's a short book, not many chapters, just several chapters. And with that, I don't know how long this was or how long it took, but we will sign off for now on that. Thank you, and give you the next lesson here shortly.